Hi guys, what's going on, and welcome back to another video on Mount Blade Bannerlord. So, I feel like I've fairly well covered a lot of the multiplayer stuff during the closed beta so far on Bannerlord, and while I'm probably still going to do a few videos on that going forwards, I really wanted to touch on a little bit more on sort of what we're going to be expecting with some of the single player stuff. So with that, I kind of wanted to touch today on faction troop trees and a little bit of faction lore. You know, what are the 6 main factions? Where do they come from, and sort of how they're developed, and what sort of troops can we expect from them? So, obviously, as I said, there's 6 main factions, although in reality that's actually broken down into 8. So to clarify that, so there are 6 main basically factional troop trees, but the Empire, the main faction, the biggest faction in the game, is actually split down into 3 different factions, even though they actually all have the same troop tree. So there are actually even 8 factions you can actually play, but only actually 6 different factional troop trees. So, since it's easily my favourite faction, I think Vlandia has got to be where we start. I absolutely love them. They're sort of styled in the way often of kind of like the Norman Knights, and I just think they look so great. They're really, really badass, and I think they're a really nice historical faction to work with, and that easily makes them my favourite. So these are going to be occupying sort of along the west coasts of Khazait, and these actually, supposedly, they originally came as sort of mercenaries and adventurers, and they sort of worked for the various factions, and instead of getting paid in gold, they got paid in land grants and titles, and these were given predominantly along the west coast, which is kind of where they're based. And then, during a period of instability with the large empire, they actually sort of broke away, made their own independence, and formed Vlandia as their own country. And that's kind of given them quite a large piece of land. If you actually look at them on the map, they look like they're probably the largest of all the 6 main starting factions. But I think they're probably going to be suffering from that period of instability, if not far from the off, and that's kind of going to be their drawback. But they have a really interesting faction tree. So I'll throw up the image now. And it looks, at least initially from the off, like the most traditional medieval type faction tree we get in the game, the real sort of Western Knights. With a real emphasis on heavy cavalry, we both get the Knights and the Veteran Vanguard, both of which are sort of going to be a sort of heavy cavalry unit. I think one is more focused sort of as a lance unit, and one as a sort of shock cavalry. And then, of course, we have the Vlandian Sergeants and the Vlandian Pikeman at the bottom of the tech tree. 2 sort of seriously awesome looking sort of heavy dismounted knights type units. Particularly the sergeants, who just look particularly badass. They just look like sort of the epitome of a Norman knight of the period. Absolutely wonderful. And of course, if you didn't realise, Vlandia obviously goes on to become Swardia in 200 years' time in the Kaldarian sort of world, and that's obviously where they come from, and obviously we end up with sort of Swardian sergeants, so it kind of ties in with what we'd expect with the sort of Swardian tech tree longer down the line, and it's kind of cool. And then we also get access to sort of a short little crossbow tree down at the bottom with some Vlandian sharpshooters at the bottom. It's not a great in terms of the amount of range, that's sort of the only range unit they get. But a really interesting tech tree. Obviously, starting off with the recruit, all of the 6 main faction troop trees seem to get this sort of, basic peasant, very similar to Warband in that sense. Equipped. This guy seems to be equipped with sort of a 2-handed sort of pole arm, a sort of glaiver or a billhook of some description, before you can then split off into sort of the infantry branch and then the cavalry branch. So yeah, so really cool little selection on the faction unit tree. Really nice faction. Certainly probably going to be the one I'm going to be playing with on the off, sort of once the single player gets released. So moving on from the Vlandians, we move on to Sturgia. These are sort of the northern realm. What eventually will become sort of the Nords in Warband in the future, and it's sort of the the Kingdom of the North. So supposedly this was set up when basically people went really in search of sort of the wealth of furs that can be sort of gained from up there, which are really valuable within the rest of the Empire. A series of boom towns then sort of set up, which attracted more and more people. Eventually, these people ended up making some marriage pacts with the Nords, and then in a time of war with the main empire, they elected themselves a prince to sort of try and defend themselves and to lead them into battle, and basically this prince ended up becoming a hereditary office. Although, supposedly, the monarchy does not really sit all that well with the fairly independent people of Sturgia. And this kind of actually seems to be reflected in the faction tree, because the opening unit we see is actually the Sturgian volunteers. It kind of shows it's not a conscripted unit in a kind of a way of a lot of the others. So I think this tech tree is kind of still in a little bit of development and kind of a little bit up for change in kind of what it was. But we see sort of a much more sort of raiding style troop tree. We see sort of the mounted raiders, you know, those horse raiders, the mounted Huskars, you know, much more sort of lightly armoured, not really like the heavy cavalry of Vlandia, but sort of a lighter, faster, more nimble raider cavalry. We also see sort of a lot of the things we would expect from a fairly northern race, you know, as these Sturgian berserkers, as well as sort of a sword guard and veteran warriors, you know, and epitomising these sort of real heavy sort of sword Viking type infantry, which I think is kind of what the faction is supposed to be loosely based on, representing a fairly northern race, fairly hardy, you know, sword, shield and light raider cavalry. I think it's going to be a really interesting faction to play, particularly given its position in the Empire. I think it's going to kind of make for quite an interesting one. So, next up we have the Khuzait Khanate, the real steppe nomads of Bannerlord. So, supposedly these guys used to be a real loose confederation of just a vast variety of different clans, often which were warring against each other, and were really dominated by the Empire, who sort of used bribery and sort of various other techniques to kind of keep them warring amongst themselves. However, supposedly more tribes started to move in from the east, and the Khanate found itself in such a position that they were either going to get flattened unless they united. So they kind of joined together under one ruler and formed the Khuzait Khanate, and sort of through a series of raiding and wars they managed to sort of conquer large chunks of the Eastern Empire and establish themselves a little bit of a kingdom. But after the death of the last king, they're kind of in a fairly precarious position, with a lot of the clans feeling they should have more authority and to be able to be a little bit more independent than they currently are. So the actual faction troop tree is pretty similar to as you would expect from sort of a steppe nomad type faction. Real emphasis on the horse archers, as well as they have some decent dismounted archers. And then that's really what the bulk of the troop tree is all about. Kind of really focuses on this range. Going to be probably really effective in field battles and sort of the more open terrain. I think we're going to struggle probably a lot more once they get into siege battles, because, you know, say a lot of them are going to be ranged units, a lot of them are heavy horse archers or lance cavalry. I think that's going to kind of make a difference. They do get two decent infantry units though, sort of these sword units. Probably not quite as heavy as some of these sort of Empire or Vlandian sort of medieval knight type units, but certainly going to be some pretty interesting units. But I think these guys are really going to dominate in the field, because they're going to be almost full cavalry focused armies, and I think that's where their real strength is going to lie. But certainly an interesting faction. I'm guessing they're sort of based a little bit sort of off either the sort of the Huns or transitioning into the Mongols, of these sort of Eurasian steppe nomads. That seems to kind of be the main focus of these guys, and certainly makes for an interesting faction. So, the Empire. This has obviously got to be the main faction in the game, and as I mentioned earlier, it's actually going to be split into three, with the Northern, Southern and Western Empire. Now, obviously, pretty much without a doubt, this faction is based sort of on Rome and the Romans, and perhaps a little bit sort of the latter Byzantines as well. We sort of see that in the troop tree. You know, the main foot infantry are the legionaries. You know, we've also got things like the Bucellarii, you know, which is sort of some of the later Byzantine cavalry as well. So it's really kind of quite clearly based on that. And we also see they're not ruled by a king or a monarch, but an emperor elected and backed by a senate. And that's kind of obviously part of the Roman tradition. They even talk about in the game how they cannot dare to ever be ruled by a king. You know, this is really harking back to some of the sort of Roman traditions. Obviously, it's kind of cool faction. I kind of get why they've now split it into three, probably to make it a little bit more balanced. Otherwise, you're starting in an absolutely enormous empire if it was sort of all three united together. But it kind of makes sense that they split it. But they all share the same faction troop tree. Obviously, like all the other factions, the Empire kicks off with sort of this Imperial recruit in this sense. You know, again, sort of a basic peasant troop with some sort of long armour, some description. Just going to be archer fodder, I should have thought. Really not going to stand up very well. But then we split across a variety of different units. We seem to get a decent amount of sort of heavy cavalry, as well as a fair bit of sort of heavy archers and stuff like that. we see sort of archers, and it doesn't seem to be shown on this troop tee, but from what I understand, they also seem to have sort of a heavy crossbowman as well. So you're going to have that choice between heavy archery infantry and heavy crossbow infantry. So you're going to kind of have that flick depending on which one you prefer. You're obviously also going to have that heavy cavalry as long as that sort of bucellarii, which is sort of these heavy personal bodyguards, may possibly going to have a sort of a mix between both ranged and melee cavalry, kind of in that sense, sort of like a medium cavalry, which would kind of be cool. And of course, the mainstay of any Imperial force, the legionary, is going to sort of form the backbone of any army. Those sort of heavy infantry, probably very similar to those Vlandian sergeants, that going to be that kind of unit. So yeah, kind of an interesting territory. I think if it wasn't for Vlandia, I think Empire is probably going to be the second faction I'll be most interested in going for, particularly kind of with that link to the sort of Roman heritage. I think it's really kind of interesting. So, Battania. This has got to be probably the one I should be most loyal to, since these are kind of based on sort of the ancient Celts, sort of around sort of Britain and France, and sort of the Celtic expansion around that period. These are sort of the sort of much more native owners of Calradia. These are the people here originally with their hill forts and their little tribal huts and their tribal nature. And they've kind of been resisting invaders, first from kind of the Empire when it tried to take over the region, and kind of more recently from Sturgia, that it's got sort of to its east, and Vlandia over to their west. They kind of idolise the sort of tribal honour system. While they do have a high king, he struggles to exert authority over the number of clans that they have available. Although supposedly more recently, following sort of the number of threats that they face, they are trying to unite into a more traditional kingdom. So, as you would expect from a relatively tribal nation, they don't have much in the way of heavy cavalry. And frankly, they don't have all that much in the way of really heavy units altogether. They are focused on much more on sort of the lighter, faster, more agile units. So we see sort of some of the Battanian horsemen over on the right of the territory, sort of a light raiding cavalry, probably not going to really be going heavy head-to-head with the Empire's cataphracts, but much more skirting around the flanks of the battlefield. We get some real good quality archers though. Supposedly the Battanians are masters of the longbow, so we're going to be seeing some really high damaging bow units sort of emerging from the forest, unleashing their arrows, dealing a ton of damage and then pulling back or engaging in melee. We then get some sort of the heavy infantry and sort of a trained spear line down the bottom of the flanks. The heavy infantry look kind of cool because they're one of the few heavy infantry that seem to wield sort of a two-handed weapon as their main, which is kind of interesting. The lack of shield may prove to be a bit of a trouble for them, but it's also going to kind of make them kind of a fun one to deal with, and probably can deal with an awful lot of damage once they sort of get in and close and out of range of any enemy archers. And the spearmen are probably going to pull more sort of the main defensive line of the army. Yeah, kind of an interesting faction. It's nice to see that all the factions have kind of their own unique playstyle and their own unique faction tree, and each one seems to actually be fairly distinctly different from each other, which is going to kind of make it pretty interesting. And of course, last but not least, we have the Aserai. These are sort of the desert people, probably loosely based on kind of the people coming out of Arabia, sort of the Middle East, that sort of period, and that sort of area. These are going to be sort of the desert warriors, focusing sort of a lot more with sort of camels, slave soldiers and tribesmen. They supposedly settled there under their collective ancestor, Banu Aserai, and that's kind of where the name actually comes from. Apparently all the tribes supposedly claim him as an ancestor, and that's why they're settled in a number of different tribes, but all ruled under one king, under the Bronze Desert, as the area is supposedly known. Yeah, they kind of have quite an interesting faction tree. They seem to be pretty heavily focused on cavalry, although not sort of the heavy cavalry of sort of the Empire or Vlandia, but not quite the really light raiding cavalry of Battania. They seem to have this sort of medium, fairly fast but relatively well armoured desert cavalry, and kind of a mix of forms, some heavier, some lighter. They don't seem to have too much in the way of sort of ranged cavalry or mounted cavalry in the way of the Khanate. But yeah, as I say, this sort of medium, fairly cavalry-focused empire. I suspect we're probably going to see the introduction of some sort of heavy infantry, because currently they don't really head to have much in the way of sort of foot infantry, but I think we'll probably see that introduced before we go into early access. And they also seem to have some decent archers, although fairly fast firing. They don't have sort of the strength of the longbows of Battania. They're kind of going to make for a sort of a fairly interesting faction, but with probably a fairly sort of medium cavalry focus. We also know that there's definitely some camels in there, and who can't enjoy a faction that doesn't have some camels. So you're going to make things a little bit more interesting. Anyway, that's really the 6 major faction troop trees we currently have information of. Obviously, currently these are subject a little bit to change. I think we're probably going to see something shift around a little bit, probably before we hit early access back over in March. But I think that kind of gives an idea of the sort of troop trees we can expect from the bulk of these factions. And I think they're all fairly different. Personally, as I said at the start, Vlandian is really where my heart's at, with kind of those heavy cavalry and those heavy infantry, those heavy sergeants kind of making up the army, because I just personally think they just look easily the most badass to me. But I think there's some other pretty interesting factions. I think the Empire, as well as Battanian, has got some pretty interesting stuff. And I think some of the horse archers of the Khanate are going to make for some pretty interesting troop deployments as well. But anyway, that really is all I've got for you today. I've been rambling on for almost 15 minutes already. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do let me know what you think in the comments down below. I would really love to know which faction you're likely going to be playing with as soon as you can once the single player gets released. And of course, subscribe to the channel for a load more Bannerlord content. And I shall see you guys all on the next video.